And it's time to review the history of yoga in East European, mainly Russian-speaking domain. And as usual, everything good came here from the West. Russian Empire started knowing yoga thanks to Theosophical Society. As in previous parts of our lecture, again we have to thank them. And first books which were published in Russian Empire, except for Bhagavad Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, were the books of Ramacharaka Yogin, who was in fact not Hindu but the Englishman William Atkinson. He practiced yoga. We don't actually know where he was teaching, who was his teacher, but the books are really good, and probably most yogis of the Soviet times started their practice with these books. William Atkinson himself is quite an interesting person. He was the founder of so-called New Thinking movement, or at least one of the founders, and this movement was the precursor, the grandfather of New Age movement. Nowadays, New Age movement is largely criticized and underestimated. But without it, we wouldn't actually have the democratizing of the society, the sexual revolution, and we still were wearing some black pants. In fact, the New Age movement made a huge contribution to the Western culture. There actually were other precursors of this movement, like Lebensborn, the life reforms, the movements of nudists and naturists, and general return to healthy lifestyle. So this New Thinking movement communicated from one part with Theosophical movement, from the other with this health-oriented movement. And in the middle, there something new had arisen. Actually, the Theosophical movement was a purely intellectual teaching and intellectual movement. Just to read the Isis Unveiled, one has to have at least 2 higher educations. So the Ramacharaka yogin, William Atkinson, wrote several marvelous books. The first one which I read was The Secret Power of Yogic Breathing. It has some simple techniques of working with energy and detailed description of full yogic breathing, which is quite good for that level and that time. Then there was Paul Sedir, the Freemason, Martinist, Theosophist, and the practical mysticist. He wrote lots of interesting books in different domains. In 1980, when I was the first-year university student, I came across one book of his in the university library. Well, actually, it's about 30 years that I practiced yoga, and this lecture is a kind of celebration of my 30th anniversary yoga practice. So in that university library, I came across a section of rare books, books about yoga, which occasionally were not destroyed, as usual in Soviet times, and they appeared in the section Psychology, in the subsection Unscientific Views, Spiritism. So when I reached that section, I spent months in the library making conspects, as there was no Xerox. And one of the first books which I came across was his book, The Indian Fakirism, or The Exercises of Indian Yogis. Surely now it's sometimes funny to read such kind of books, because the explanation, the description of the exercises was terrific. But this book had a list of 150 yoga treatises, which not all of them I had found so far, although I have more than 300 treatises. And this exact Paul Sedir's list became the basis of our yoga library. So this book is precious for me, at least as a memory. So actually through these books Russia made its first acquaintance with yoga. But unlike Europe, Russia had one more way, to Tibet, which was accessible through Buryatia, which in its turn Russia always wanted to have in its control. And in this case, the next must-know person is Petr Badmaev. His surname, Badmaev, is derived from word Padma, the lotus. He originated either from Buryatia or from Tibet and came to St. Petersburg, either from Buryatian lamas or in some kind of invitation, which is a very complicated story. But in any case, this was the man who brought Tibetan medicine to Russia. He had a house in Sokolniki district in Moscow with huge enclosed lands where he grew Tibetan herbs. According to his diaries, during his life he accepted about 100,000 patients, and half of them he accepted for a huge money. and the other without any payment. Moreover, he had a very interesting schedule. For 40 minutes he accepted a patient, and then he had 15 minutes sleep, then another patient, and another sleep. So on he worked. He was the first one who translated the canon of Tibetan medicine, Juchi, into Russian, and this canon was translated into Russian before it was translated into any other European language. Here I present the first reprinted edition of Juchi which I have in my library. Of course, now it's not that good as the modern academic critical edition, but at those times this was brilliant. Moreover, this man had a huge influence on Russia's history. As any other mystic, this was the man who created Rasputin. And there is a widely accepted version that he also managed Rasputin. And of course he was the private physician of the royal family and of Rasputin itself. Also, Badmaev has his political idea which he promoted, that Russia should connect Tibet to its territories, thus relieving it from the English rule. But of course it was not meant to happen. There was a revolution in Russia, Badmaev was repressed. Moreover, nobody knows how old he was. The datings of his age are very vague. Some say that he was over 100 years old, which is also a widely accepted version. But there were other ways in which Russia became fond of Tibet. In 1899, a man originating from Buryatia, with unpronounceable name as for me, but with the family name Tsivikov, was sent in expedition to Tibet. Before him, no European could penetrate Tibet, although now I know that there was an English intelligence officer who managed to go through. He was specially trained around 2 years, and he was trained that he could step with the steps of the same length, and no matter how tired he was. Of course, for the purpose of making a map. He has two things: the Tibetan mill, within which there was the masked astrolabia, by which he made the astronomic inference of his position, and beads, within which there were not 108 beads, but only 100. Thus, he managed to make a first map on how to go to Lhasa, because Tibet, as you know, was closed since 18th century. It was a closed territory, and foreigners were punished, and the punishment was something like taking off the skin. So from the other side, Russia was interested in Tibet, and Tsivikov was Buryat of origin, and moreover he was a Buddhist. So in this sense he could penetrate Lhasa as the Tibetan pilgrim, and he managed to accomplish the journey. Here I show the first photograph in Europe, and maybe the first photograph in Tibet as well, where we see the Dalai Lama's palace in Lhasa. His journeys Tsivikov has described in a 2-volume edition named Buddhist Pilgrim near the sanctuaries of Tibet. This work is actual and is interesting to read even now, although we have been to Tibet.